I just want to very quickly look at some history on Indigenous policy that I think is important to put some context to what governments have tried to do and where I think things ought to head. Certainly since World War II, and really all I've gone back to is kind of World War II to have a bit of a think and talk to people, so it's probably the case before the war, World War II as well, but there has been explicit focus on increasing wellbeing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, absolutely no question about it. But there are very slippery underpinnings. There's this continued tension of how to derive benefits from the economy whilst maintaining a strong sense of culture, and I'm sure you're all aware that Aboriginal people on the mainland have the oldest continuing culture of humans. But I guess my proposition is only recently have the frameworks been properly aligned. If I can give a very rough sketch, and I'll say this is a very rough sketch, so it is not complete. A lot of nuance I'm going to leave out, but just for the purpose of the, was probably now too long. From World War II to about the end of the 60s, very much a human rights approach. Often driven externally, international criticism, saying, you know, you have a racial problem that you need to do something about Australia. And Australia responded, extended the basic human rights that non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people just take for granted to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But I don't think the transitional issues were properly thought through. At the end of the 60s, the minimum wage was made binding. I don't think the idea that people working on stations because they're Aboriginal could be paid in rations was acceptable. But to move straight to a binding minimum wage with no transition, obviously there would be unemployment consequences. That's what was seen, that's what was evidenced, and that's still to this day trying to be pared back. Extending welfare, a basic right, Australians treated that way, didn't really foresee what was going to occur. Similarly with closing the missions, that was a source of education to young kids, even if the whole mission lifestyle probably wasn't an appropriate one, and also removing the prohibitions on alcohol. All things that from a human rights perspective had to be done, but I think the transitional issues probably, it's fair to say with the benefit of hindsight, which is always easy, wasn't done properly. And again, a very rough sketch from the 70s through to the 90s, I think there was broadly a shift to self-determination, acknowledging and giving effect to a distinctive sphere of Indigenous people's rights, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's rights. Land rights being a very good example. Both legislated land rights in the Northern Territory and New South Wales, and then the High Court in the early 90s articulated it for the Torres Strait Islanders and extending throughout mainland Australia. Both the human rights and the recognition of the importance of self-determination, key fundamental underpinnings of greater equity, but clearly not sufficient to push to greater equity of both opportunity or outcome. Because neither really went to the issue of how to improve labour productivity. Neither went to the issue of how to bring Aboriginal people into a situation where they could share the gains that mainstream Australia was doing. So more recently there's been yet another shift, and it's been focused on very much an individual wellbeing improvement. People probably aware, heavily influenced by the philosophy of the eminent philosopher and also economist, Amartya Sen. The focus there is improving individual capabilities so they can participate in the modern economy, and yet having that coexist with the human rights and self-determination gains. A far more sophisticated approach, one that recognised the inherent heterogeneity of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. So how's it all working through? Well, people probably aware COAG set down a number of building blocks. If I could just set those building blocks out very quickly: early childhood, education, health, economic participation, healthy homes, safe communities, and governance and leadership. Those who are fans of the development literature, Lord Stern, back in 1990, I think prior to being a Lord, wrote a paper, Determinants of Economic Growth. Tremendous little paper, I think, and really made the emphasis in the development literature. You really got to look at both the soft infrastructure and the hard infrastructure. Going in building roads and schools aren't enough if people can't actually get together and decide, well, this is actually a good thing for the future. And so I think that's kind of heavily influenced that, although not explicitly. And the government has also articulated, or COAG has articulated, gaps to close. In closing the gap, also there's this emphasis on resetting the relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The National Congress of Australia's First People, when that gets underway, that'll be a tremendous step in that move, as was reinstating the Racial Discrimination Act in the Northern Territory. So I think we're at a much better spot now. And the approach overall pays a much closer attention to elements of building human capital, converting the human capital into realisation of this investment through the increase in labour productivity, being able to get a job, being able to get high wages, being able to create wealth and moving into the standard sort of Western developed economy that most of us share in, whilst at the same time maintaining that cultural identity. And I would hope it works. Obviously, I sit in a role where part of my job is to do what I can to work with others to try to make it work. And after all, I'm an optimist. No one spends 18 months of their working life working on a comprehensive tax review of Australia's tax system and coming out the other end feeling very good about it without being an optimist. You may say deluded, I say an optimist. And just I might finish with one thing. If people thought getting a handle on the entire tax system of Australia, all 125 taxes, which is actually 256 if you treat the payroll tax as separate taxes, which arguably they should, how they interact, how that interacts with the transfer system, the Commonwealth state system and local government rates, and what should be a better system to set Australia up for the future. If you think that's complicated or complex, you ought to try some Indigenous policy, because it's much, much harder. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rob.